Hi. I'm really very happy to be here. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me. And thank you to the Chicago Humanities Festival for covering this topic of higher education, including when the coverage has a title like The Great Mistake. It's not totally auspicious. I'm temperamentally optimistic, so we are going to be able to fix it by the end of this, although it's going to take a little bit of work. And thank you also to Chicago for supporting something like the Chicago Humanities Festival. It's a really very unusual thing on the national scale, and I'm really quite happy to be part of it. This book, I'm the most excited person in the room about its appearance, I'm quite sure. It's a bit of a battle, and I will tell you a little bit about that as we go. But just a couple of things about it in general up front. The first is that it's about why college really costs so much. There's some hidden costs that I talk about in here. And then the second thing is it's about why, or what society, what the public really needs from universities. I think we are underfunding universities, which is kind of the major issue that a lot of us already know something about. I mean, it's a disaster in terms of what the trend line looks like, because we lost our complex understanding of what it is that public universities really do for society, for the current generation, for past generations, and for the future. So I'm going to be focusing quite a bit on that. There's a kind of a headwind that I've been having to deal with this and is working this out, and that's the conventional wisdom, or sort of the normative story that we hear about the situation in public universities, what their problems are, and what they should do to fix them. And then the story goes like this. After World War II, we used public money to build these fantastic systems, the big flagships, and then the regional colleges that we attached to the flagships and also developed in different ways. And that was good for the period. It massified education, and it was good for volume. But now we have different needs. We need more sophisticated or focused teaching, and we need institutions that are more flexible and adaptable, more aware of what the outside world wants, more aware of what business wants, more aware of what the economy needs. So as a public institution in this storyline, universities got isolated from society, encouraged students to take intellectually interesting but profit-wise not so lucrative subject matter, philosophy, art history, anthropology, etc. And you've heard major public figures say out loud that they are glad that are sorry that their daughter majored in them, or are hoping that their daughter will not major in those. Everyone from Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, to Barack Obama himself. And so if this is the problem, that is the public nature of the university, then the solution is pretty straightforward, which is to introduce market forces and private money into it. So the solution has been, in the discussion that no doubt all of you in this room have heard at various points, is that we need to economize, marketize, commercialize, financialize, and privatize. And that the result of these business-oriented changes in the university will be greater efficiency, better focus, and a better fit between the university and the outside world, society, economy, etc. All right, this book argues that everything I just said is wrong, that story is backwards, it's upside down. I don't know what the reverse is for stories going in the right direction. Backwards. It's not accurate about what the strengths of the public university were, and it's not accurate about what the effects of private money have been on it. So that's the story that I'm here to tell you about. The great mistake is that we no longer allow public universities to focus on the fullest possible education of the whole society. And what's being wrecked is the institutional and the financial capacity to deliver a fully educated society to the society that wants it. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but I thought that I should give you something of a sense of the background that I bring to this, and why somebody whose first book is about Ralph Waldo Emerson has ended up writing 3 more books, not about the stuff that I would really prefer reading to financial reports about universities, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, or Melville, or Mary Gateskill, who was speaking elsewhere earlier. There's really 4 reasons. The first has to do with my parents. They're first generation college, and I never stopped noticing the difference that it made in their own lives. They had a larger sense of their own place in the world. They had a sense of how big the world was. They were interested in the application of knowledge to all sorts of problems, so you could fix things with knowledge as opposed to ignoring what knowledge was telling you. They made friends with complexity, and they were interested in difficult skills that took a long time to learn. And those 2 things, complexity and difficulty, I think are not sufficiently appreciated in the society that we live in now. And I learned quite a bit from them and about the system that it enabled otherwise, normal, impatient, focused on their own daily lives people have a slightly different perspective. The second thing was that they were both white, my parents, and they went to college for free. And I would like that to still be possible for minority-majority California and for a country that is increasingly minority-majority as well, and will be at some point in the lifetimes of some of us in this room. When California was 90% white, it seemed obvious that we should have free college. Now that the K-12 population in California is 70% students of color, suddenly we don't have enough money. And I would not like to think, none of us would, that white folks will give white people stuff for free but charge people of color. But that is in effect what has been happening, whether anyone intended it or not. So what I would like to see, and that's part of what these 3 books now are about, is it's an effort to make a diverse and amazingly interesting millennial generation. I say that as somebody who spends an enormous amount of time with them week in and week out. Given the same opportunities, low cost, high quality, mass quality, that magic formula that we used to have, that has to be upgraded, not downgraded, so that they will be part of solving the problems that face us as a society and as a planet. The third factor was that I was at the front lines of worries about limited learning and about academic attainment, both within my university and just sort of in the country as a whole in the 2000s. It started to look to me like, even at a fairly selective public university like mine, that the bottom half, or the bottom 60% of the student body was having a harder time keeping up with the others, that we didn't have the resources and the services that would allow everybody to learn in the way that was appropriate to them, or bring them from the different levels that we face, up to the front of the class. And we were also seeing this on the international level. At one point in the 2000s, the US was ranked 29th out of 30th in an international comparison for college attainment, as a country that had been basically in the top 2 or 3 for most of the preceding several decades. And when you break that out by income, I think I have a horrible slide for this, yes. What you see is a tale of 2 nations. The top half by income is the best in the world, the bottom half by income is the worst. So this is economically foolish because we are essentially wasting a big chunk of our population. It's ethically untenable. It's socially fracturing. It's a cultural disaster. It's just the human waste on a scale that I found very distressing, and was also seeing smaller signs of it within my own university. And then the last thing was I was involved throughout the 2000s with planning and budget for the academic senate for my university system, for all of the campuses put together. And we did some reports. One of them went to the Board of Regents, arguing that the university's funding was not kind of going up and down with the business cycle, but what we were seeing was a secular disinvestment, a long-term removal of money that we actually did have from the system. So the claim was always, well, it's just we don't have money. If we had money, we'd give it to you, but we don't. And when business improves and the economy gets better, we're going to give it back to you. But in fact, and here's one of the vintage slides from that period, what you see if you look at California, this is the University of California case, the share of the money that people actually have in their pockets, this is real personal income, it fell about in half over this pivotal period for the knowledge society, the knowledge economy, in a state that prides itself on being, a leading knowledge economy in the United States and in the world. Right? So there's this kind of perverse thing that's going on. And the other thing that I was seeing was that administrators on my campus were good sports about this. They didn't want to complain too much, and they thought they would alienate everyone, taxpayers, particularly if they complained. So they went out and found private funding sources to try to fill in that empty space in the upper right. And they succeeded. So there's more sponsored research, there's more philanthropy, more business partnerships, more attempts to develop real estate assets into revenue-generating activities, et cetera. So what I saw was that this helped particular programs to which the philanthropy or the particular grant was targeted. In fact, I'm now running a research program on learning with a gift from a former graduate of my department. So I don't want to, look the gift horse in the mouth too grudgingly. But overall, it didn't help the campus at all. Particular pieces got wealthy. There was kind of a gated community effect, but the overall system did not improve. And as I was saying before, non-remunerative activities like helping students write better struggled. So I began to wonder about this search for private revenue streams. This thing that we sometimes call privatization, the shift just most simply from public revenues to private revenue sources. So I began to ask, is privatization actually hurting the university rather than helping it? Is privatization the solution, or not the solution, but instead the problem? Is privatization, instead of being the cure, actually the disease? Is privatization subtracting money from the university rather than putting money in? So that was the origin, because my answers to these questions began to be sort of tentatively yes, and began to conduct research into the pieces of the system that were leading in this kind of destructive direction. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through a cycle, and I first want to explain a little bit about why there are so many steps in it and what it's doing there. And it's basically this. It's very difficult to just blurt out, as I did now, that private market forces are the problem and not the solution. And the reason, it upsets people, we are, as a nation, are very committed to market forces. This is a cultural commitment and not just an intellectual, economic one. It's really been baked into us over the last 30 or 40 years. We don't really have it. It's not just New Deal policies. We don't really have that thing that I associate with my grandparents, which is an understanding of sharing of costs as a form of efficiency and progress. I mean, my grandparents got that as Depression people. My parents, not so much. I mean, one of the signs of graduating from college was that they immediately switched to being Republicans. And it's on some level, the individualization of their achievement made it logical for them to make that shift. Whereas for my grandparents, what they had, they felt they had always built and developed with others. That it was it was community activity, and there were programs that only the government could do that were transformers of the quality of their lives. And that understanding just began to recede, and it receded in the consciousness of senior leaders in public university systems as much as it did elsewhere. So the argument has to be fairly careful, and there has to be a lot of pieces, and someone like me who wants us to engage in complex thinking about what the problem is and what the solutions are has to come into a talk like this and offer too many moving pieces for it to be a really nice story. And I'm kind of aware of that problem now. I would like this to be more of a narrative of people doing what I think the university does, which is experience redemption, transformation, and progress. But first we have to go through a series of problems. And the point that I'm going to be making as we do this is that each of the individual decisions makes sense. So this is not really a story about bad actors in management. There are some, but there aren't that many. What it really is are a bunch of very well-intentioned people doing the best with what they have, going to conferences, sharing ideas, coming up with pretty similar ideas over a period of time, which also becomes a problem, and then implementing these with good intentions, seeing them not work out as planned, and then continuing to try to keep them going because they just feel they have no other choice. So what we have to look at is this, is a cycle of decline in which number 6 or number 3 or whatever it is internally logical and coherent, but turns out to be a complete mess when you connect it with the others. All right, so we start at the top. The first fundamental formative mistake is that the university retreats from a definition of itself as a public good. I mentioned a little bit about this just a minute ago. I just want to remind you of something that you probably already know, which is that the United States is, as an economic success story, owes quite a bit to some bad things, colonization, et cetera, but owes a lot to this, really one of the best things that we've ever done, and that is achieving the highest level of attainment in whatever form was most relevant to global society at that time. So by 1850, the US, although it's still kind of a poor country and shaky in all sorts of ways, has the highest high school attainment in the Western world, that is in the North Atlantic world. By 1950, 100 years later, it has double the high school attainment rate of the United Kingdom. Backing again to the Civil War, Congress actually took time out from the Civil War itself to pass the Morrill Act, which gave land to states to build universities that were directly connected and relevant to the communities in which they were situated. They were not competing for global rankings. They were trying to help people who lived in that town, that county, and that state solve whatever the problems were that those people had. Right? So that's the idea behind the land-grant college. The generation that was born in the 1930s, which includes my parents, then had the highest college attainment rate on the planet by the 1950s. And this continued for basically another generation, kind of through my generation. I graduated from college in 1980. And then it began to decline. And we're going to talk about this in a second, but one of the reasons is that the university, partly out of an understanding of the shifting political climate and wanting to adapt to that, narrowed the university's purpose to two basic things. One is increasing the salaries of graduates over what they would have earned if they'd just gone to high school. And the second was using science to make inventions that could then be patented and licensed and handed off to industry to put into the marketplace for the sake of the economy. Both of these are, at least initially, private market goods. And what that means is that indirect, non-market, and social benefits of the university, which one economist has calculated are 2/3 of the total, become invisible. They become sort of the dark matter of the universe, which is, in fact, this very economist metaphor for this. So we over-focus on this one set of things, and we lose the rest of it, and then a whole bunch of things, philosophically and budgetarily, become extremely difficult. For example, it's much harder to justify high levels of public funding if a college degree is a private good. So you then are suddenly, struggling uphill against an argument that says we don't owe you this at all. All right, so that's the first problem, and it looks like this only the whale sees all the non-market value of the university. And the rest of us are essentially just seeing the top stuff. So back to number 2. The university then starts to look for private funds, partly because they're more prestigious, partly because it's culturally expected, also because they need them, because they're starting to lose, and stage 4, their public funding. And what this means is they enter into a series of partnerships in which the partner, the outside partner, expects the university to contribute. So in some cases, there's all sorts of good things being done as a result of this, but in some cases, if not most, the university is ponying up internal funds to an extent that it didn't bargain for when the initial arrangements were being made, and which is never talked about afterwards, and certainly not explained to legislators or to taxpayers. So for example, sponsored research, outside sponsors that do research, whether it's foundations or private business or the federal government, when you average all of this together, they require 19 cents on the dollar of internal funds from the university. Most of us assume, well, you can make money on all of this outside money, research funding, because it's just money that's coming in exchange for work. It, however, requires internal contributions that are absolutely enormous. Here's another iceberg. Indirect costs are attached to research, and they are often, this percentage I think is off. This came from a vice president for research's research presentation a while back. But the buildings, the staff, the utilities, a lot of things that don't actually apply to a particular grant also have to be paid for by the university, and sponsors are very reluctant to do this. So what you end up getting is a contrast between these two different kinds of statements. You have the headline on the left, which is UCLA researchers bring in basically $1 billion in research and development money, which sounds fantastic. It's like UCLA is a profit-making enterprise. But then when you actually subtract out the costs that UCLA incurs to support all of that research, you get the one headline that has ever appeared on the subject, as far as I can tell, in the United States, which is that millions of dollars are lost on research. So the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger cut the University of California by 20%, we lost about $700 million. In that same year, the university lost $720 million on supporting research, as it does essentially every year. In other words, if we could eliminate all of the costs of outside sponsorships to universities, sorry, let me go back to this, we would be able to have made up for the entire cut that we received in one of the worst years in the university's history. So this is not just a marginal cost, it's quite a substantial one. Another issue is administrative bloat. People say, well, why can't the private sector be more, or public sector be more efficient like the private sector? Well, the answer is the private sector is hiring people in order to face business, face partnerships, offer better services to students who are now paying a lot more to go to the university. And what it looks like is this. All the way on the right-hand side, you see that full-time tenured faculty has grown 23% in this 40-year period. And all the way on the left-hand side, what you see is that non-instructional professional people have grown over 10 times faster. And what you also see, and something that we'll come back to, is that in the third bar from the left, full-time non-tenure track faculty have grown at 10 times the rate of regular permanent faculty. This has some good reasons, but one of the bad reasons is that the university, in order to deal with what we could call mission creep, with all these other activities that it's doing in addition to the core missions of teaching and research, has had to hire skilled people to deal with all of those additional activities. So what we're getting to is, before we get very far down the cycle, are budgetary holes that are very hard to even admit, difficult to discuss on a policy level, and almost impossible to find money to fill. So the search for that budget balancing has become increasingly desperate over the years. Next, something you're very familiar with, large and regular tuition hikes. And the claim that I make is that this is to cover expenses incurred by the addition of private funding revenue streams, the replacing of public with private. This leads in turn to cuts in public funding, and you're probably asking yourself right now, well, isn't it the other way around? Isn't it that state government takes this huge whack out of a University of Illinois or the University of Arizona, the University of North Carolina, and then managers of those systems have to scramble to find new money to replace the loss, and the best source of that is students. And my answer to that question is yes, in any given year, because there are often kind of emergency tuition hikes. In one case, 2010-11 of 33% in my university, in order to respond to massive I mean, ridiculously disproportionate cuts, much larger than are applied to other state agencies in almost every case, every state. But over time, the causality is actually the way that I have it here, because what's happened is universities began to raise tuition at higher than the inflation rate in the 70s. And public universities didn't do this on as high a base, and they didn't do it quite as often, but they did do it. And this accelerated in the 80s. So by the time that major crises are occurring, like in 2008, every state legislator in the United States has learned the lesson that if they cut a university, the university will just raise tuition. So they would say to us, I can't not fund disability services for indigent elderly people, but I can not fund students because you can just charge them and they can get loans. So you can see, again, it's one of those decisions, this is a really key one, where the internal logic is very good and the consequences are very bad. So over time, universities raise tuition and states cut, and then it leads us to the fifth stage, which I'll just say one thing about before we get to. This down cycle is the price of privatization taken together. It's the overhead costs, the personnel costs of bringing in private revenues. It's not free money. And then there's this other additional very big cost, which is the private money drives out public money. It will just be withdrawn by public agencies because they can see that you can just get the money from somewhere else. So this leads to another very familiar consequence, which is exploding student debt. It passed, in aggregate, the size of revolving credit in the United States about 2010. It's up to about $1.3 trillion, which is too big a number for me to even picture. It is continuing to grow, even though, as we know, incomes on average are not. And it's continuing to spread to lower income students. The only thing that has made anybody feel better about the growth of student debt is the idea that it doesn't affect poor students. So in California, we had a blue and gold plan. It says, oh, we're hitting the middle class, but everyone from a low income background is okay. Well, if that is true, then why do we have, oh, you already know this. Why do we have this chart, which shows that on the left, students that come from families that make less than $30,000 accumulate, this is really before the crisis, the same amount of debt at a public four-year college as somebody who comes from a family that makes, say, $100,000. The answer is that the financial aid system, so-called high tuition, high aid system, does not in fact protect poor students. They are obligated to borrow. There's a whole bunch of interesting things I'd love to talk about, except almost no one will talk to me about. Gapping, are all students gapped? Are all students forced to borrow a certain piece of what they need every year? I think the answer to that is yes. There's a lot of interesting things that are going on behind the scenes. But in any case, these students are not protected. It's a general problem for students regardless of major and regardless of their income, as long as it's not so big that they just really don't have to pay anything. All right, this brings us to the next stage, which is that by now everybody is angry, everybody is frustrated, everybody is looking to fix the problem and fix it now. And this means a pretty much permanent budget austerity on university campuses. This is particularly true on public university campuses, but it's also starting to affect very prominent private universities like the University of Chicago here. So one of the things that is sort of necessary to do is to deal with payroll costs. And what that means is that permanent faculty are replaced as growth happens with contingent faculty. And people are, whenever possible, replaced with technology. I mean, this is kind of two elements of American business culture that universities have cooperated in adopting. And so what that means is recently is the MOOC wave of 2012 and 2013. Remember the massive open online courses. And the basic claim is that with technology today, you can get good or better educational results, by replacing professors, especially in large situations like this. This is kind of one of those low cognitive gain situations that we were supposed to eliminate from universities. Replace them with interactive technology, computer screen-based, and sometimes with course assistants that would help, and the ability to email a professor, but most of it really happening as an interaction with the screen. Well, they found that the educational claims to be as good or better were false, and it was particularly bad when you applied it to students of color. And so this is a product of a research group that I'm involved in, looking at California community college students. F to F means face-to-face. So you probably thought you were safe from having to look at any numbers or charts because I was an English professor. Sorry, I am anomalous. I want to assure you, if you do this again, you will hear an English professor. You won't be looking at stuff like this. The face-to-face are the red bars and online is blue. And this is a sort of a fairly long period of time, and there's tons of data like this from this system that has almost 2 million students. And what you see is that face-to-face is always better. And what you also see is that the gap for Black students and Hispanic students is greater. So the best way to lower learning attainment for what are called underrepresented minorities, URM up there, the best way to lower their attainment is to put them in online instructional situations. And yet that is still a very attractive option for financial and other reasons on many university campuses around the country. Right? So we have leveraging going on, we have public money going to private folks, we have lower educational outcomes, which gets us to stage 7. And that is that we already have a very unequal system, and the cuts have made it even more unequal. And it's made the poorer parts of the system struggle even more with offering a version of education that is remotely like what happens at the wealthier universities. As you can imagine, I have a picture of this too. If you look all the way on the left, what you see is that the smallest number of students, that's the green bar, gets the most per head. And this is, so, think University of Chicago, that are Northwestern, those are good examples of this. This is an average, the number, if you compare, Stanford to De Anza College, which is a local community college, it's more like a 10-to-1 change. If you look over there on the right, you see the largest number of students getting the least amount of money per head. And this is before the crisis. It's gotten worse, and these are averages. So the actual situation, when you think about the resources available to students who go to premium schools, U of C, Stanford, Yale, et cetera, you're looking again at least a 10-to-1 ratio, and sometimes more like 20-to-1. So what the result is quite predictable. This is another version of a thing that you saw earlier, which is the upper 25% is doing just fine. Over the course of 50 years or so, gone from 40 to 77% in terms of the percentage of this younger age group that gets a bachelor's degree. If you look at the bottom half, 50 years has produced almost nothing. Gone from 6 to 9% at the bottom. What we have, in other words, is a public university system that is successfully replicating the unequal allocation of resources and outcomes by income that we expect of private systems. So instead of the public system cutting against this, saying, okay, we're going to bring everybody up to a certain level, what the public system has done because of these resource inequalities is locked in the stratification, and that gets us to the last stage. This is an odd word, and I'm going to back into it a little bit. The idea of the public university was basically to make poor people middle class, and if you're just looking at it in economic terms, and to create a kind of a mass middle class that was relatively unified. So to take my own situation, my mother went to UC Santa Barbara when it was a teacher's college. But she was supposed to get kind of the same quality of instruction in Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and other mind-expanding things as her friend who went to Berkeley would get. The idea was kind of functional equivalence, even if some of the trappings weren't there and the people were more famous and better paid at one campus or another, right? So it wasn't just a leveling thing, but it was a comparability project. So we would not have a class society, we would not have a caste society, certainly. And this system was going to make that possible. What's happening now is as you increase resource inequalities, just going around the cycle, you increase learning inequalities, and you then have an excuse, a justification for a fractured middle class. And in this fractured middle class, the top, which continues to get premium instruction and cognitive gain of various kinds, they are going to do just fine in terms of middle class or upper middle class. Like maybe that's 25%, maybe it's 5%. We don't really know. Everyone else is going to be struggling with kind of medium cognitive gain, pretty good, but not necessarily great learning through these systems, and therefore medium or low wages. When you put a large number of people with medium skills in global competition with people who also have at least medium skills in other countries who are willing to work for less, you guarantee that the wages of those middle skill people will decline. So the post-productivity system that we have is basically going to lock this problem in, and that is that we have an economy which for a long time actually paid people for increasing their productivity by improving their wages. That stopped a long time ago. And what we're looking at now is a situation in which that is likely to continue indefinitely into the future, with the caveat that a small number of people are going to be accepted from this, and an ever-growing number of people in the middle class are going to are not going to rise with their productivity. Okay, so what we're trying to get to is this. We're facing the fact that a lot of people in this kind of ex-middle class no longer feel like the university pays for them, and I've just been explaining that in some ways it isn't paying for them if they're taking on too much debt, if they're not going to the right schools, if they're not getting the kind of learning that they need. So what we need to do is actually start from a different place, and in the few minutes that are remaining, I'm going to go through this and just give you a few sort of kind of numerical examples of how these would work. The first is that the university has to be recognized as a public good. It's like vaccination. The more people that have it, the more effective it is. It's like parenting. The more people that are better at it, the better everybody's kids are, the better the whole society is. It's the same with education. Its value increases with the maximization of its consumption. And that's justifiable never in private market terms and always in public good terms. Next, think, well, how can we actually fix this? How can we reduce the subsidies to partners to basically to zero? One place to start would be to take the federal research money that is now going to private industry, which does very little basic research anymore, take all of that money and give it to universities. The numbers are about the same, the amount of money that universities spend internally to subsidize research and the amount of money that the feds give to business. They're almost the same, 14.3 versus $15 billion. And what that would allow universities to do is to fully cost research and not sacrifice students or other disciplines for the sake of subsidizing outside researchers. Tuition is capped and reduced towards zero. Public funding is reset to replace tuition and student debt reduced to zero. You think, oh, politically impossible? Today, yes. Next week, maybe not. But where I would start is with student debt. Have as a goal zero debt, and then work backwards to the amount of money that each student should pay in order to not have, or could pay in order to not have any debt at all. I've done the math. It's about $4,000 for total cost of attendance. That means that states would have to come up based on how much the average cost is now with about $19,000 per student per year. It's about $200 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But remember that we already spend $150 billion on a financial aid system that has produced this debt disaster in the first place. it would cost another 50 to fix it. Continuing to move up here, universities rebuild the educational core for creative capabilities. That means focusing on our core processes of teaching and learning, leading to number 7, creativity instruction as a goal for poor students at community colleges, at underfunded, obscure places. That is the same in quality, the same in aspiration as what is happening at Stanford and Yale at the University of Chicago. Again, it seems utopian. I would say is we don't have any choice. The costs of not doing that are enormous, including not being able to solve things like climate change. We struggled for a long time with educating pretty well a good percentage of our population. It will be quite a bit better if we are able to educate to a high level a much larger percentage of our overall population. And I'm going to just end with a couple of pictures of this. This is the public university as it is today, overcrowded, papers, feedback, individual attention being replaced with Scantron tests, where students are like holding their heads for the entire time because they're afraid of being accused of cheating by monitors. What we need to do instead is something that I've tried with a senior seminar that I had a couple of years ago. This particular group was in a co-taught course that I did with partners at Stanford and Duke. Much of the thematics of the course had to do with the unbelievable inferiority of the public school technology. Stanford was in a glassed-in media booth in their library, and Duke had a converted warehouse with this, with brick walls in the background and a tech team devoted just to the quality of their sound and their video. We had a laptop camera that somebody had given us taped to the back of that gray chair, and that allowed basically the people at the other schools to see about 3 of the folks in the front of the table and not see or talk to anybody else. So there was this rich school, poor school technical issue, and then there was the group formation and the intellectual progress that I had the pleasure and the honor of witnessing in each of these somewhat looking goofy students. The guys in the back, the one with the Coke can, the one with the sunglasses, one is a screenwriter now actually selling material. The one in the back is a poet who works in music production. Half of these kids have gone to graduate school. The thing that was amazing to me and what keeps me in this business is the pleasure of taking basically, or being part of a process, because it's really not me, it's a group process that takes ordinary smart people with nothing special about their backgrounds, with limited resources, with small town surroundings, with immigrant parents, with all sorts of disadvantages, and watching them move from one day to the next into a position where they are on the level of kids that go to Stanford and Duke. That is what happened in these humble surroundings. And that is what I am writing this work in order to make a general possibility. So the last thing I would say is all of us agree on the need for equal justice. And what I think we now need to face in the United States is funding and constructing equal education for all. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. There are microphones, and I hope there are questions. I'd love to talk with you. She's already moving there. I see 2 over there, I think.
Thank you for this wonderful vision. What are the politics of it like beyond Bernie Sanders?
Sorry, who's speaking?
Oh, hi.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, thanks for this vision. I'm wondering about sort of what the political realities are that you see that might serve to move it forward.
Well, 2 years ago, I have a colleague named Bob Samuels who wrote a book called Why College Should Be Free. And he said to me the other day, 2 years ago I was a lone, crazy voice in the wilderness. And last year it became part of the Democratic Party platform. So we've seen, really in 2012 it was completely off the table. Now Hillary Clinton has endorsed it in a way that allows all of us, assuming that she's elected on Tuesday, which we can't, by the way, make sure you vote, that she that can be held accountable too. There are some real problems with this issue that we probably don't want to get into here, although I'm happy to talk to you a bit about it afterwards. But I think that the debt problem is a driver and the educational quality problem is a driver. And I would like to, I guess the short answer is a coalition of parents, of students who want to learn more and better and get better help than they are getting now. High-end scientists who are also struggling, even with the subsidies that they get, to fund all of their students, to fund their laboratories, and to produce the kind of work that they want to produce, and have us get on the same side of this issue. The first step is disclosing what the problems are, because we've been divided up by people not understanding that. And I think then the next step is working with the Clinton people on designing a sustainable version of the free college program that's already on the table.
Hello, Harpinder Rajmani. Thank you for a lovely talk, and thank you for wearing a tie. I cannot get my California family to wear a tie at all.
It's the last one.
I know all of my family lives in California. I wanted to stress on two things. One, you showed the graph on which the first biggest expense the colleges have increased is, of course, bureaucratic costs. And the study out of University of Minnesota, you probably know that, and they found that most of the increase in cost was actually because of all the bureaucracy. In your recovery cycle, you mentioned very little of it. So why don't we work first on what we know is costing more? And this actually pervades. I'm a physician in medicine. You can look at public schools, same problems, that we have enormous growth in bureaucracy and very little growth in actually teachers that we need. And this is a chronic problem beyond just the universities.
Yes.
And we need to fix this somehow.
My hope for that is that we would be able to convert administrators into teachers, that we could have more complex team-based teaching that would use folks that are now doing administration. I'd rather not lay people off, I'd rather bring them into the educational process. But so then we would have a large staff, but we would be a staff that is delivering educational intensity in a way that we don't right now.
What do you think the solution is to that situation? What should universities be doing when they can get such cheap labor, and what's the impact on your prognosis?
I think they should be converted to permanent people. And I think we should cost that out and figure out how much it's really going to be. I think it's going to be less than we think. So that means benefits, that means, it means lower teaching loads, which is something, but that means more educational quality. The thing is, I hate to, I'm not really kind of a financial reductionist, but you do get what you pay for on some level. And there's these amazing people who've been pushed into the contingent labor market, and they simply don't have the time, the working conditions to work with students in a way that today's students need. And that's especially true at the less selective schools, where less prepared students often wind up and then need more attention and then get less attention instead, because the professors they have are teaching 5 or 6 courses at 3 different schools for $5,000 a course, right? It's completely unsustainable. So I just think we have to, as we are willing to do in our banking system, bite the bullet of cost. And, you didn't hear me say this, bail out, fix the higher ed system with a much smaller amount of money than what we spent to fix other serious problems. So I would just do the two things: bring administration into the classroom and the laboratory more directly, and bring precarious labor into a position of security. I just haven't seen a number that shows it's unaffordable. I think it is affordable. Sorry, you have no idea.
I understood the cycle and the direction of the arrows, but did you actually find numbers to support those? Because that's the trick.
Wait, are you talking about the recovery? Which?
The first
yeah.
circle.
Yes.
But what are the actual numbers in terms of the cost flow and so forth, and allocating people's time? It's terrible, detailed, boring work, but that's what you need to make the thing work.
You know, if
And
you're
by
interested
the
in that,
way-
I have a book for you
No,
that's
by
out in
the
the
way-
lobby.
Go Cal Bears.
Yeah, sorry about last night. Yes, next to you. Right there. And then up front. Yes.
It's another problem is that this cycle also causes less academic freedom, and we don't teach students how to think critically.
Do I think it's connected to the cycle?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. It's harder. That takes time. I was just talking to Jonathan before we started about people like the ones in this picture. The labor intensiveness of producing cognitive gain, as it's called, like really learning things and really improving skills, not making, parenting is very similar. Some things take 7 times, some things take 35 times. And we don't, generally speaking, have the conditions that allow this to happen for non-elite students. There was another one over here and then here.
I do want to welcome you to Illinois, where higher education budgets have been devastated in the last year. MAP funding for students was non-existent in 2016, and it's uncertain for 2017. It is a mess. But that's just a kind of editorial comment.
No, it's just facts you're stating.
Yeah. I was struck by what I think are 2 parallel figures. You have a figure of high-income students as opposed to lower-income students and graduation rates. And the high-income students do very well, and they graduate at a high rate. There is a parallel finding for K through 12 education.
Right.
And when you look at high-income students, and they're usually in very well-endowed school districts, their achievement scores, are competitive with the best in the world. And then when you look at the low-income students, they are the worst of the worst in the world. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of parallelness there, and of course, you're talking about higher ed, but it is a continuum.
We've always taken real pride in democratic distribution of resources. And for me, the most important of these is intelligence. We need the full democratization of intelligence. And I don't think anybody really wants an elitist K through 12 or an elitist higher ed system where 5% do really well and the rest don't. And so I think that we can appeal to the even the medium-term self-interest of people to get them to reconstruct and refund a thing that would work, actually achieve the democracy project.
We seem to live in a world where many people believe that market forces will fix everything and that they are capable of measuring value. So when you talk about public good, where is the other authority that will determine what that is?
It's us.
We have time for one last question over here.
I'm serious.
Chris, thank you
Yes,
for
sir.
this very tight, and I would endorse it as an extremely accurate argument. You made a glancing reference to the ratings game, and a glancing reference to public research universities pursuing global rankings when they were created to serve the citizens of their states. To what extent would a solution require top-ranked universities to increase their capacities, to serve more students from their states, even at the cost of dropping in the rankings because it meant admitting students who didn't fit those neat little number requirements? in effect, and to what extent is it incumbent on the students and their parents to resist the lure of rankings?
No, you answered your own very good question. I mean, it is that parents are going to have to learn what's inside education. It's been black boxed and there's a number on it, and that's wrong. And then that sets up a whole chain of incentives, including faculty experiencing their own value to some extent as connected to their institutional placement and its ranking in a global order. So the practical issue is are there going to be resource sacrifices in order to make this larger system work? And the answer is not if we do it right. Well, we'll try to do it on the cheap in the beginning. So free college will mean you're just going to be poor college. That's the first move. And then there has to be negotiation that keeps that from happening. The negotiation has to be based on disclosure of information about what the real costs are, so that legislators don't have any idea that they're subsidizing extramural research. They have to learn that, and it has to go on from there. But I think that most of the faculty that I know are interested both in this kind of their global majesty of the quality of their work and their research. And we did get into it because we love to think and we love to produce ideas, and we want to take the next step, which requires money and time and enormous effort. And yet, we're also very interested in the progress of society, the evolution of humankind, and our ability to help do that directly, not only through research, but also through, hands-on instruction. So if a simple practical thing would be to get Newest News and World Report and a lot of these other rankings to have a much broader understanding of what goes into value, and then that will create I love loops. I mean, that would create a feedback effect in which we, faculty and administrators can have a broader understanding of what our value is to society. And about that, I'm optimistic. I think this one is really at the end of the line.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our program.
Thank you.